Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Great Depression era and the presidency of FDR. And in this lecture, we're going to continue the discussion started in the previous lecture, discussing some of the acts of the first New Deal. As described in the last lecture, the acts of the first New Deal ranged widely across efforts to prop up and aid the failing economy, help with issues of unemployment, and help with direct aid to the needy. I mentioned several acts in the previous lecture. I'll mention a few others here. Things like the National Employment Act, which created a federal agency to work with state agencies to assist with employment services and help to get people jobs. It also created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which helped people to refinance their mortgages through the federal government to help them from losing homes, and the Farm Credit Act, which served the same purpose for farmers. And as we will see in our discussion of the Dust Bowl, many farmers were losing their farms in 1933 and 34. But perhaps the signature act of the first New Deal, the blockbuster New Deal Act, was the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, which created the NRA, not that one, but the National Recovery Administration. This act, which was pulled together early in the first New Deal era by many of FDR's New Dealers who came with him from his administration in New York State, the so-called Brain Trust, which included a number of young intellectuals, some college professors, Harry Hopkins, Rexford Tugwell, Francis Perkins, and so on, brainstorming, throwing ideas at the wall, and seeing what they could come up with. There wasn't necessarily any one right answer. There wasn't necessarily strong consensus. And the NIRA reflects that. In the grand scheme, it came to be viewed as sort of a dreadful piece of legislation with a number of flaws. Perhaps it tried to do too much within the space of one piece of legislation. And as we will see, there were elements of it that worked reasonably well, and there were others that failed. But in the grand scheme, the National Industrial Recovery Act was geared towards aiding big businesses. This is, in a sense, a form of trickle-down assistance created by Hoover, but now brought to fruition under FDR. At its heart, the NIRA called for cooperation between big business and government. And here again, we come back to the metaphor of this being a sort of war, a war against the Depression. And there was a whole branch of propaganda associated with the NRA, and you see on the screen there one of the famous emblems and stickers or decals that stores and businesses who were going along with the NRA would put that symbol in their window as a sign that they were doing their part, that they were helping the nation in this crisis. And so the idea was that this act asked big businesses to continue helping their workers, try not to lay people off, try not to lower wages, and so on. It also did look into some of the unfair work practices and competition among businesses, such as child labor, yellow dog contracts, and so on, which we will talk about a little bit later. It also catered to labor unions. In the famous Section 7A, it declared that workers have the right to unionize and bargain collectively with a representative of their choosing. And so some businesses found this objectionable, that you're asking us to cooperate, you're asking us voluntarily to help our workers, while at the same time you are empowering them to go on strike against us and work against us. So right there, you have some conflict in the way this act worked. It also created a number of other public works organizations, like the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which was headed by Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior. Ickes was a deeply caring individual. He was worried about civil rights and equality, very honest man, and tried to scrutinize every project, make sure that government money was being properly spent. And essentially, the PWA kind of echoes the Civilian Conservation Corps, but most of its projects were on the West Coast, building bridges, building dams, roads, and so on. And it also created the Civil Works Administration, which was headed by Harry Hopkins, and ultimately spent more than other New Deal organizations and hired more than 4 million workers. And the reason perhaps there were so many workers hired is because civil works tended to be smaller scale kind of civic projects. The local courthouse needs a new roof, or this government building needs new plumbing, or something to that effect. So you hire a small work crew for a couple of weeks and crank out these small scale jobs. But again, you are extending the benefits of the New Deal to millions and millions of workers. The NRA was headed up by a man named Hugh Johnson, who had a long military career. And as I mentioned, Johnson treated the NRA much like the CPI of World War I, creating this propaganda campaign. We were waging a war for the economic recovery. And as described, products and companies would emblazon their stores and products with the famous Blue Eagle emblem. But again, one of the problems with the NRA in general is that it was calling for voluntary cooperation, and at the end of the day, there wasn't a whole lot of teeth behind the restrictions and regulations that in some cases it was trying to implement. And like the AAA, the NRA ultimately was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a case called the Schechter Poultry Corporation versus United States, also known as the Schechter case, or more commonly the Sick Chicken case, because it was a case in which the Schechter Poultry Corporation, which handled its poultry business only within the state of New York, was being called upon by the NRA to follow the regulations and health codes and so on of this federal law. And the Supreme Court determined that the federal laws do not oversee state operations like the Schechter Poultry Corporation. So the NRA was struck down in this Supreme Court ruling, and frankly, some people in the New Deal, including FDR himself, breathed a sigh of relief that this monstrosity of an act with all of these different things going on was overturned, and then they set about to recreate and reestablish the better parts of the NIRA one by one. And we'll talk about some of that process going forward a little bit later. So that gives us an idea of the acts of the first New Deal and the kinds of things that were put in place during the 100 days. In general terms, we're putting people back to work, we're reviving businesses and the banks, we're giving aid to those people who need it. Some 46 million people around the country received some form of aid from the New Deal programs. And again, you can think about that in terms of the voting bloc that supports FDR over and over again. So by 1934, people begin taking stock of the New Deal and what was going on, as we can do now in hindsight. What kind of things were working or seemed to be working? Well, by 1934, we start to see unemployment figures coming down. We start to see wages on the rise, the stock market starting to recover, banks are stable, people are feeling more comfortable putting their money back into the banks. And so in all of these ways, the New Deal seems to be improving the situation. We haven't solved the problem, but things are getting better. At the same time, there are some limitations of those first New Deal acts. There are elements in them, as some historians have pointed out, of racism and sexism. Most of the benefits distributed in the New Deal programs were distributed by white local officials. Blacks and women were typically the last ones to benefit and sometimes didn't benefit at all. There were problems, particularly with the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the black sharecroppers in the South, who were the ones who really didn't benefit from that program at all. While the money was sent to the landowners, the people who were not farming, the ones who were put out of work, tended to be black sharecroppers in the South. And the same is true of elements of sexism in the New Deal. Women often were not accepted into the jobs, and at its heart, the New Deal didn't necessarily intend to apply as much to women and minorities. The objective was to restore work and a solid footing for white men, who were viewed as the core of America's labor force. We can also look at numbers like unemployment and everything I mentioned above as a success and say, well, while they're getting better, they're still far from where we want them to be. And so unemployment is coming down, but it's still far higher than we want it to be. So there remained a lot to address, even if we concede that the first New Deal was helping. So historians have wrestled with this problem of FDR and the New Deal and the racist and sexist elements of the way those programs were implemented. And scholars have come to a variety of opinions about FDR and those within the New Deal. And certainly there were some who were overtly racist, although most scholars would come up short of describing FDR that way. And many historians look at a program like the Indian Reorganization Act as an example to dispute claims that FDR and the New Dealers were racist. The Indian Reorganization Act, which was headed by John Collier, was the first act in our nation's history that actually gave land back to the Indians. It allotted lands to individuals and reorganized them into tribal holdings, which increased the overall land held by native tribes. It also recognized tribal governments and encouraged the restoration of tribal customs. So these were things that our nation had inflicted upon Native Americans from the very beginning of the earliest exploration and settlement. And now in 1934, we make a legitimate effort to amend some of those kind of actions. And so some scholars look at an action like this and say, if the New Dealers were genuinely racist and had such harsh intentions, why would they go out of their way to implement a program like the Indian Reorganization Act, which was not perfect and which continues to have some critics in and of itself? But in general terms, these are not the actions of individuals who are seeking out to deprive minorities of their rights and so on. And so this is just one act that some scholars point to dispute the claim of FDR and the New Dealers being racist. Well, certainly FDR does have his critics among historians and also among many Americans living at that time. So in the next lecture, as we continue to reflect on the successes and shortcomings of the first New Deal, we'll talk about how Americans at that time viewed what was going on, and some of the critics and skeptics of the New Deal living in the midst of the Great Depression.